In the shadow of Turin's bustling streets, a philosopher's unraveling mind collided with an act of raw compassion. Friedrich Nietzsche, the iconoclast who challenged morality and divinity, threw himself between a whip and a beaten horse, a moment of desperate humanity that heralded his plunge into an abyss of madness, leaving behind cryptic letters signed by gods and labyrinths of myth. The final days of Friedrich Nietzsche's lucidity remain shrouded in enigma, punctuated by an act of visceral empathy that became legend. On January 3, 1889, the philosopher, already teetering on mental collapse, encountered a scene that would crystallize his descent: a cabman mercilessly thrashing an exhausted horse in Turin's Piazza Carlo Alberto. Overwhelmed, Nietzsche rushed to the animal, weeping as he draped himself over its neck in a futile gesture of protection before collapsing to the cobblestones. His landlord, Davide Fino, discovered him in this state and dragged him home, unaware this moment would immortalize Nietzsche's fracture between genius and insanity. Historians like Paul Strecker later contested the timeline, suggesting the incident occurred days earlier, a discrepancy underscoring the haze surrounding his breakdown. A torrent of delusion followed. Nietzsche began signing letters as Dionysus, the Greek god of ecstatic chaos, and the crucified, a stark juxtaposition of pagan vitality and Christian suffering. To his colleague Jacob Burckhardt, he penned a rambling missive on January 4th, invoking Ariadne, the mythic guide who led heroes through labyrinths, a metaphor perhaps for his unraveling psyche, now lost in a maze of grandiosity and despair. These fragments, blending classical illusion and fractured reality, offer no resolution, only haunting questions about the line between prophetic vision and madness, and whether the horse's plight was the trigger or merely a mirror to a shattered mind. In another letter sent to Peter Gast in George Brandes, Nietzsche signed it as the crucified. In other letters, Nietzsche had said other strange and chaotic things. For example, some letters contained calls for the death of the Pope, the German Emperor Wilhelm, and the anti-Semites. The outburst of these letters made Nietzsche's family extremely concerned to the point where they, within a week, visited Nietzsche in Turin and brought him back to Basel, where he was diagnosed with syphilis, which was assumed to be the cause of his mental deterioration. This diagnosis is one that has been considerably questioned, however. There is no evidence of such a syphilitic infection. In all probability, there can be no definite verdict on the matter because of the inadequacy of the data. It seems that the brain tumor diagnosis is no more likely to be true than the syphilis story. Because the theoretical possibility of exhuming Nietzsche's body and performing an autopsy using the latest medical technology will never be realized, we will never know for certain whether an underlying physical pathology caused his mental condition. Nonetheless, the most plausible conclusion appears to be that Nietzsche's madness was in fact a purely psychological condition. Nietzsche never recovered and continually decayed cognitively until his death on August 25, 1900. Nietzsche was reported to remain sometimes silent for weeks on end, sporadically utter biblical lines taught to him in his early childhood, and be in a general state of chaos. Carl Jung had his own view on the reasons behind Nietzsche's insanity. In Nietzsche's seminal piece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he depicted poetically a madman and many persons that could be personally attributed as Nietzsche himself. As Jung points out, many of the figures in our dreams or in our expressions of art, like poetry, are us, yet we do not realize it. For Jung, Zarathustra is Nietzsche himself. In Jung's lectures analyzing Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he identified what he believed to be the quarries in Nietzsche's madness. It was an over-identification with a particular archetype. Archetypes for Jung were psychic mechanisms that modulate and mediate human thought and behavior. They are the instincts of mankind passed down through many evolutionary generations. which eventually formed into a distinct and coherent mode of thought and behavior. There is good reason for supposing that the archetypes or the unconscious images of the instincts themselves, in other words, they are patterns of instinctual behavior. There is a thinking in primordial images in archetypes which are older than historical man, which are inborn in him from the earliest times and eternally living and lasting through all generations. Still, they make up the groundwork of the human psyche. To give an example, the hero whom you are likely to enact when saving somebody. According to Jung, the archetype that Nietzsche overly identified with was the archetype of the wise old man. But what is this wise old man archetype? The old wise man is a typical figure, and therefore we call it an archetype. One meets it in legends and folklore and in innumerable texts and works of art, which shows that it is a generally human idea. Well, you can say the old wise man is surely the figure of the great teacher, the initiator, the psychopompus, in other words, spiritual guide, the living soul, and then he can contain the idea of the self for a while as a sort of vision or intuition. He knows about it. He teaches it because he is the psychopompus who leads the initiate on the way to his completion. This wise old man archetype is a cross-cultural image and an archetype part of our biological system that emerges at certain times in our life. According to Jung, this archetype is usually presented as kind and wise, using knowledge to guide people onto the right path. It is prone to transpire in turbulent times in the minds of humanity as a guide. For example, one might say Jordan Peterson filled this very role, and this is why he became popular so quickly. When one is possessed by the wise old man archetype, there is a great psychic inflation, according to Jung. This is dangerous as it threatens to take overwhelming control of the individual. This psychic inflation, Jung comments, can be seen in the story of Thus Spoke Zarathustra by the fact that the story commences where Zarathustra lives high up in the mountains for 10 years. For Jung, to not be overwhelmed by the possession of such an archetype, there must be a freeing of the energy, an inflation to a deflation, and escaping in this built-up energy. Remember that these characters, like Zarathustra, are also Nietzsche himself. Accordingly, Jung noted how in the East, the wise old men were depicted as being able to fly because the psychic energy is so strong that it must never be trapped. Soon, Zarathustra comes down from the mountains and into the forest. This is necessary for the deflation of psychic energy in this archetype. Indeed, in the text, it says Zarathustra must become an ordinary human again to deflate from this peak. When Nietzsche enters the woods, he comes across an old man. This, for Jung, is another depiction of the wise old man, and, of course, another representation of Nietzsche. Zarathustra climbed down alone from the mountains and encountered no one, but when he came to the woods, suddenly an old man stood before him who had left his saintly hut in search of roots in the woods. Thus spoke the old man to Zarathustra. Who this wise old man is, according to Jung, is obvious based on Zarathustra, referring to him here. This old saint in his wood has not yet heard that God is dead. This wise old man is the old Christian religious spirit that was dying at the time of Nietzsche's era, who has not yet accepted the death of the Christian religion. Furthermore, this old man is watching Zarathustra carry his old wise ashes while Zarathustra traverses from the forest into the town to the collective of man. By nature, the ashes represent the burned elements of the body and its symbolic connection to the spirit. It represents the Christian spirit. The ashes also represent the death of God and Zarathustra, the Redeemer, representing Christ and resurrecting from the ashes to something new. Indeed, Nietzsche referred to himself as the crucified in his letters, after his madness, representing the classical resurrection story of the crucified Christ. When Nietzsche enters the town, he tells the townsfolk, "I teach you the Overman." The Overman, also known as Übermensch, is the resurrection after this death of God, the new spirit to guide humanity. For Jung, Zarathustra is also the Superman or Übermensch or Overman. The Superman was made to combat the valueless structure of nihilism after the death of God, and Nietzsche believed these Übermenschen would create the values and remove nihilism. For Jung, the Übermensch, and therefore Nietzsche would have to take on the role of God in creating values, and it is this very role that Jung also attributed to Nietzsche's insanity. One does not simply become a god. If you wish to read Nietzsche's famed text of the death of God, I have added it below in the description. After the death of God, the world was in a state of confusion. No longer did we have Christianity or any religion guiding us blindly. We instead moved on to new values that we had never tested before. And also, the world had become increasingly empty and valueless. This valuelessness, in part, was due to the absence of Christianity. Nietzsche, in his archetypal role, the wise old man, his remedy was to create our own values through the overman. However, he did greatly grieve the absolute tragedy and suffering of the death of God. It is clear here, and according to Jung, that Nietzsche is possessed by this archetype of the wise old man. Zarathustra even says to the old man in the woods, Zarathustra is bringing them the gift of his overflowing wisdom. Before we travel further, how exactly does possession of an archetype, or particularly the wise old man, make one go insane? For this particular insanity to emerge, the archetype has to engulf and overwhelm the self. The self is always the sum total of conscious and unconscious processes. It comprehends consciousness. Consciousness is included in the self like a small circle in a bigger circle. The self cannot be contained in an archetype because an archetype is merely a content, a figure of the collective unconscious, and cannot possibly contain the thing in which it is contained. The archetype is contained in the unconscious, and the unconscious and the conscious together make the self. The self is a concept of totality which contains all the archetypes and individual consciousness at the same time. The symbol of totality is always a circle, and one can say that in the center is the conscious, and around it is the unconscious, containing the archetypes, among them the archetype of the old man. The self is a unifying circular structure that encapsulates all the mental processes, conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. For an archetype to possess one and cause insanity, although it does depend on the archetype, it must swell, grow, and engulf the self. No longer is the self the guiding principle, but the archetype itself, and this is the root of the insanity. In the case of the wise old man archetype, it is extremely dangerous to be overwhelmed by it due to the extreme psychic energy it involves. Nietzsche was engulfed, and no longer was Nietzsche in control. He was possessed by this archetype, and it was seen in one way by his self-referring to archetypal mythological gods, Dionysus and the crucified. As mentioned earlier, the crucified symbolically represents the death of Christ and the resurrection thereof. Nietzsche was torn between Dionysus, the chaotic, powerful, and instinctual, and the dead, soon-to-be resurrected Christ, the crucified. Unfortunately for Nietzsche, his resurrection failed, but also Nietzsche's assumption that he knew what God is, knew that God was dead, and also that he could create and enforce any value he wished, which, for Jung, only a god in this case could truly do, greatly contributed to his insanity. All things considered, Nietzsche was in an extreme state of chaos and disarray. More so, the self, for Jung, was also the stable and unifying core of the psyche across time. In order to have an identity, we must have a coherent sense of ourselves across time. It was clear Nietzsche also lost his identity by this engulfment of the archetype and by his self-referring of himself being Dionysus and other mythological figures. This will conclude part 1 of the video. we will delve deeper into the nuances of how Nietzsche's actions, philosophy, and psychology drove him mad through Jung's analysis in part 2 of this video. Fundamentally, though, Nietzsche's possession by the wise old man archetype, and therefore the loss of himself, was the main culprit in his insanity.